What if the very foundation of your life, the faith that gives it meaning, was suddenly ripped away? And what if the love offered to you came from the most unlikely source, the very one your traditions taught you to despise? Amidst the sweet scent of incense and the humid air, in the vibrant heart of Samaria, Gomer, a high priestess of Baal, raised her arms to the sky. She wasn't just any woman. She was the living bridge between the divine and the earthly. Today, the oppressive desert sun wasn't the only weight on her shoulders. There was also the burden of a starving nation, of divine promises that seemed to dissolve into the dry air. At 24, Gomer led complex rituals with innate grace, her embroidered veils and jewels shimmering under the relentless sun. The mesmerized crowd echoed her husky chants, pleading with Baal for rain and fertility. For her, the temple wasn't merely a place of rituals. It was the epicenter of her entire life, the source of her purpose and power. Yet, behind the facade of unwavering devotion, a disturbing silence began to echo. News of prolonged droughts spread like wildfire through the land, and whispers about a crazy prophet named Hosea, who proclaimed judgments and the wrath of an unknown God, began to infiltrate even the most sacred sanctuaries. Gomer tried to drown out these murmurs. Her role was to maintain hope, faith in the cycle of life, the belief that Baal would bring the promised abundance. Malkiel, her revered mentor and the high priest, had taught her since childhood that Samaria's strength lay in its devotion to its gods. But the reality of the growing famine was undeniable. The anxious stares of the people, the veiled desperation in every prayer for rain, chipped away at Gomer's certainty. Where was Baal's fertility? Why did the soil remain cracked and the crops wither? The idea of another god, one who demanded exclusive devotion and seemed to condemn everything she represented, was an affront. It was a threat to her very identity, her purpose, and the order of her world. She felt the conflict, not with her faith itself, but with the absence of answers from her God amidst such affliction. Now get ready to dive deep into the incredible journey of a person who, with courage and vulnerability, overcame unimaginable challenges amidst pain and uncertainty. You'll learn how self-compassion and recognizing your own limits can be applied in your own life to face moments of crisis and triumph. Let's get started. And so, under a scorching sun that should have brought life but only brought desolation, Gomer was about to have her world turned upside down. A man, a prophet of an angry God, was about to challenge not just her faith, but the very essence of who she was. He was the herald of a pain she never imagined, and a redemption that would change everything. Suddenly, the fervor of the festival was shattered. A sharp cry erupted from the crowd, and all eyes turned to the entrance of the temple courtyard. A man, in simple robes and with a gaze that seemed to carry the weight of the desert itself, entered the sanctuary. He wasn't a priest of Baal, nor a merchant seeking blessings. It was Hosea. His face was etched with dust and the fervor of a divine mission, and his eyes, fixed on Gomer, seemed to penetrate her soul. The priestess felt a chilling shiver run down her spine, contrasting with the suffocating heat of the day. This man, whose somber prophecies she had tried to ignore, was now there, before her, in the heart of her sacred world. A deathly silence fell over the crowd, who moments before had been clamoring to Baal. Only the sound of the wind carrying sand and Gomer's accelerated heartbeats could be heard. Hosea raised his hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that seemed to command heaven and earth itself. His voice, though hoarse, resonated with an authority Gomer had never heard, not even from Malkiel. "Thus says Yahweh," he thundered, and each word felt like a rock, shattering the temple's foundations. "I will take for myself a wife of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by departing from Yahweh." Hosea's eyes didn't leave Gomer. "And you, Gomer, shall be that woman. You shall be the living sign of Israel's unfaithfulness." Gomer's world spun. Her breath caught in her throat. Those words weren't just an accusation. They were a sentence. a prophecy cast directly upon her, before her people, in her own sanctuary. The humiliation hit her like a lightning bolt. Hosea, the prophet of Yahweh, the blasphemer, had just called her a wife of whoredom, not as a personal insult, but as a symbol, a living representation of what his God considered the nation to be. Her status, her identity, her purpose, everything was dismantled in seconds. The crowd began to murmur, some in shock, others in indignation. Malchil, his face contorted with fury, stepped forward, but Hosea remained unshaken, like a rock in the midst of the storm he himself had provoked. Gomer felt the blood drain from her face, her legs falter. How could a just God demand such a sacrifice? How could a prophet dare to profane a sacred place with such insolence? It was absurd, an aberration that defied everything she knew about the divine, about respect, about decency itself. The weight of that moment was unbearable. Gomer was no longer the respected priestess. She was, in those moments of acute pain, merely a living symbol of shame. The word whoredom echoed in her mind, not as a judgment of her actions, but as a condemnation of her existence. It was the breaking point, the end of her life as she knew it. Hosea, having delivered his message, didn't wait for a reaction. He turned and left as abruptly as he arrived, leaving Gomer standing in the middle of the courtyard, her dignity shattered, her future uncertain, and the silence of the crowd screaming louder than any words. She felt as if the very ground beneath her feet had given way. Life with Hosea was a paradox. What Gomer expected was the brutality of captivity, punishment for being who she was, the personification of Israel's whoredom. Instead, she found a patient silence, a stillness that confused her more than any shout. He didn't touch her in anger, didn't look at her with contempt, only with a kind of deep sadness and a tenderness that disarmed her. His home was simple, devoid of the adornments and incense aroma she knew so well. The scent was of earth, of grain, of an ordinary life that was foreign to her. Gomer felt like a fish out of water, each day a silent torture. Hosea spoke little, but his few words were always kind, devoid of any judgment. This irritated her. How could he be like this? She tried to find the trap, the manipulation hidden behind that inexplicable affection. Malchil had always taught her that love was a transaction. You gave devotion, you received blessings. You offered your body, you received pleasure or security. But Hosea asked for nothing. He simply lived beside her, tilling the land, praying to his invisible God, and treating her with a dignity she didn't think she deserved. The loneliness, amidst this strange kindness, was overwhelming. Gomer missed the bustle of the temple, the power she felt leading rituals, the validation that came from the eyes of worshippers. Her identity was broken, and Hosea's love was a mirror that reflected her own inability to understand it, to receive it. She felt exposed, vulnerable. One day Malchil, cunning as a fox, appeared in secret. He found her near the well, with a smile that seemed full of compassion. "Gomer," he whispered, "the temple misses you. Baal misses you. You are wasting your divine gift with this man who has profaned you in the name of his God." Malchil's words were like a familiar balm. He spoke the language Gomer understood. Power, purpose, a place where she was important. "Your place is with us, Gomer. This prophet is trapping you, diminishing you. You were born for glory, not for this ordinary life." The seed of doubt, already present, blossomed in her heart. Malchil seemed so sure, so confident, and his talk of divine gifts and glory echoed what she had always believed to be her true worth. Hosea's silent love seemed pale and ineffective compared to the promise of her old mentor. Gomer began to lean back towards familiarity, towards the promise of a purpose she understood. Baal's rituals, the nights under the stars, the feeling of being a central figure, all of it called her back. Hosea's unconditional love, so incomprehensible, seemed like a weakness next to Malchil's seductive strength. It was an internal battle, the strange, suffocating kindness of a prophet against the promise of power and acceptance from the world she knew. Gomer found herself in the middle, torn between a love she didn't understand and an identity she had lost, and which her old mentor promised to restore. The anguish of this choice was a slow fire in her soul. She saw the sincerity in Hosea's eyes but couldn't translate it into value for herself. For Gomer, value was something earned, something negotiated. Love that simply was, that asked for nothing in return, was an unbearable enigma. The first child came, and with him, a strange and fragile hope in Gomer's heart. A boy. In her arms, he was a piece of her and Hosea. A bridge she wasn't sure she wanted to build. His features were his father's, but the life nestled within her was hers. Maybe, Gomer thought, this child could be the link that reconnected her to a purpose, even if it was one she didn't fully comprehend. But Hosea, with his grave gaze that seemed to see beyond the present, brought the prophecy into their home, into her new motherhood. "Yahweh commanded me to call him Jezreel," he announced, and the heavy name fell upon Gomer like a cold stone. "For in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel." Jezreel. That name was not a blessing, it was a condemnation, a constant reminder of destruction, of the divine judgment hanging over her nation, and, by extension, over herself. The weight of her son's name became unbearable, a burden that suffocated any glimmer of happiness motherhood might have brought. Malkiel's manipulation intensified. He visited her more frequently, always at night, like an inviting shadow. "You see, Gomer," he whispered, his eyes fixed on hers, "this prophet brings you not life, but death. He binds you to prophecies of destruction. Baal is the god of life, of fertility. Your son deserves a name that brings blessings, not curses." Malkiel's words resonated strongly, echoing Gomer's despair. She looked at her son, at the prophetic name Hosea had given him, and felt a growing terror. This man, with his incomprehensible love and his somber prophecies, was cursing his own blood. It was too much. Baal's transactional love, which promised blessings in exchange for worship, seemed safer, more logical, more loving than Hosea's love, so enigmatic and laden with pain. In a fit of desperation and defiance, Gomer made the decision Malkiel had so eagerly awaited. One night, while Hosea slept, with her son asleep beside him, she rose. The house was dark and silent, but her soul screamed. She needed to escape that suffocating love, those prophecies that condemned her, that name that sealed her son's fate. She ran back to what was familiar, to what promised power and identity. She ran to the temple of Baal, into Malkiel's arms. She was choosing the power she knew, the devotion that gave her a place in the world, even if it meant rejecting the unconditional love she couldn't understand. It was a desperate escape, a cry for help for a meaning that seemed to have abandoned her. The return was bitter. The Samaria she found was not the same. The drought, once a distant rumor, was now a cruel reality. The fields were parched, the cattle dying. The rituals to Baal, once vibrant and full of promises, now seemed empty, their chants muffled by the famine plaguing the city. The temple, once her refuge, was now a mirror of her own disillusionment. I wonder how many times in our lives we run from true love, because it doesn't fit into the boxes we've created for what we think love should be. It's a silent pain, this flight from our own redemption for fear of what we don't understand. Malkiel's allure, once so captivating, began to fade. He was no longer the charismatic mentor, but a man consumed by desperation and greed. The rituals, which once channeled power, now became frantic, almost wild. A last gasp of faith in a God who seemed deaf to his people's cries. The drought was relentless, and famine morphed into palpable despair. Gomer, who had hoped to reclaim her purpose and glory, realized the cruel truth. Malkiel no longer saw her as a priestess, as a partner in divine rituals. She was just another tool, a resource to be exploited amid the crisis. Her divine gifts were no longer valued. Her body, however, was the currency of exchange. The nights in the temple, once filled with devotion and chants, became an underworld of whispered negotiations and shady transactions. Malkiel, to appease hungry gods, and more realistically, wealthy men who still had something to offer in exchange for a glimpse of hope or pleasure, began to use Gomer in a way that corroded her from within. She, the once revered priestess, was now merely a temple prostitute. Her body used to pay debts that weren't hers, to sustain the illusion of a collapsing cult. Every touch, every gaze was a blow to her soul, a cruel reminder that her worth had become purely transactional, something to be bought and sold. Shame and revulsion mingled with the pain of disillusionment. Gomer found herself trapped in a nightmare she herself had chosen, trading Hosea's incomprehensible love for the familiarity of a world that now consumed her. Where was Baal's promise? Where was the glory Malkiel had promised? Only emptiness and degradation. With the nation on the brink of collapse, harvests non-existent, and the temple treasury depleted, Gomer's usefulness as a priestess, and even as a temple prostitute, came to an end. Malkiel, unscrupulous, made the final decision. It was time to get rid of her. In a cold, calculating act, he sold her. Gomer was dragged to the slave market, her body marked with a price, her dignity trampled in the dust. This was rock bottom. She was no longer a priestess, no longer a wife, not even a prostitute with any purpose. She was merchandise, a piece of flesh to be haggled over. The emotional pain was overwhelming, more cutting than any whip. She was stripped not only of her clothes, but of her entire identity, all her hope. Amidst the clamor of voices and bodies being traded, Gomer felt utterly alone, broken, forgotten. In that moment of profound desolation, she wondered, was this the end? She, who once guided rituals and was revered, was now reduced to nothing, a mere object in the hands of men. Who could rescue what was already so destroyed? Who would care to give value to something so worthless? It was proof of her darkest belief, that without transactional value, she was unworthy of love and condemned to oblivion. In the dust and humiliation of the slave market, amidst the acrid smell of sweat and animals, Gomer, huddled and almost invisible, saw a figure approach. Her heart, already so bruised, tightened with fear of the judgment that would surely come. She didn't lift her gaze, convinced it would be just another man, examining her like a piece of livestock, measuring her worth in vile coins or fleeting pleasures. But the figure was not that of a common buyer. It was Hosea. Gomer trembled. The prophet of Yahweh, the man she had abandoned, the bearer of dark names and prophecies of judgment. She expected fury in his eyes, explicit condemnation, perhaps vengeance, but, as she hesitantly lifted her gaze, she found an expression of pain and a persistent, almost irrational tenderness. There was no contempt, only a silent lament that seemed to embrace her. Hosea began to negotiate with the merchant, not with the coldness of one acquiring property, but with a quiet determination. Gomer heard the numbers, the coins being counted, 15 shekels of silver, and a homer and a half of barley. It was an exorbitant sum, a price far exceeding the market value of a slave, especially one like her, already so worn and nameless. In that moment, something broke within Gomer, and simultaneously, something was rebuilt. This wasn't about ownership. It wasn't about buying a servant for the home, or a concubine for pleasure. It was about redemption. He wasn't buying a slave. He was ransoming his wife. Hosea was paying an absurd price for her, not because she was worth that in the slave market, but because he valued her. The understanding of unconditional love hit her with the force of a tidal wave. Not a transactional love, which demanded devotion or performance, but a love that simply was, that sought her out and rescued her even when she had fled, even when she had chosen degradation. It was a scandalous love, a love that made no sense to her mind, shaped by bargaining and merit. Hot tears streamed down her dusty face, not from sadness, but from a confused mixture of relief, regret, and overwhelming astonishment. It was as if a veil had fallen from her eyes, and she saw Hosea not as the somber prophet, but as a reflection of a divine love she had never dared to dream of. He was redeeming her not for who she was, but for who he was. As Hosea led her out of the market, away from that hell of buying and selling, Malkiel emerged, as always, from the shadows. His face was contorted with rage and despair, his voice sharp with accusation. "Gomer, you have brought the wrath of the gods upon us. This drought, these evils, it's all because of you. Come back to Baal. There's still time to appease the fury." But Gomer was no longer the broken, manipulable woman of before. With Hosea's hand on her arm, feeling the warmth and security of a love that had found her at the bottom of the abyss, she raised her head. Her eyes, once full of shame, now shone with a new strength, born of revelation. "No," her voice rang firm, something Malkiel had never heard from her. "My God does not demand sacrifices of shame. He redeems me." At that exact instant, a scout's cry echoed through the outskirts of Samaria. "The Assyrians! They're in the hills!" Hosea's terrible prophecy was coming true before everyone's eyes. The nation was on the verge of annihilation, but amidst the impending chaos, Gomer made her final choice. She rejected Malkiel and everything he represented, the empty power, the conditional love, the idolatry that had led her people to ruin. She chose Hosea, the incomprehensible love, and the uncertain, yet redemptive, future. The final scene was a heavy, solemn silence. Gomer and Hosea, side by side, in a safe place in the hills, watched the smoke rise on the horizon. Samaria, the vibrant city Gomer had known, the nation she, in her blindness, tried to serve through Baal, was in flames. The terrible prophecies had been fulfilled. The destruction Hosea had so warned about had arrived. The pain was immense, a deep mourning for all that had been lost. Gomer felt the weight of divine judgment, the consequence of Israel's unfaithfulness. But, amidst that smoking ruin, there was also a glimmer of peace. She was there, with Hosea, the man who had paid the price of her redemption not by her merit, but by a love that transcends human logic. There was no complete explanation, no total clarity about what the future held for them. Life would be hard. The nation was broken. But, somehow, Gomer knew she was no longer alone. That love, so incomprehensible at first, had revealed itself as the anchor in the storm. She had been a priestess of Baal, a wife of whoredom, a slave. But now, in her heart, she was something more. A woman who had experienced the deepest shame and the most unexpected rescue. The world could burn, but the love that had found her in the slave market was the only shelter left. It was a love that didn't care about the past, only about the present and the promise of a future, even amidst the ashes. It's incredible to think how God's love can find us in the most improbable places, isn't it? Hosea whispered, as if reading her thoughts. Gomer simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the rising smoke. The answer wasn't in words, but in the quietude of their hearts. This is the end of Gomer's journey, a journey of pain, faith, and spiritual redemption that teaches us that, even when we stumble, God's love can reach us and transform us.